Professor Lily Kong. Distinguished guests, students, colleagues, and members of the SMU community, and guests from outside SMU, good afternoon. I am delighted to welcome you to SMU for the third lecture in the Presidential Distinguished Lecturer Series in 2016. Traditionally, we invite internationally eminent and outstanding academics, scholars, or business leaders who have achieved distinction in their respective fields to speak in this series. And the purpose of the series, as it was conceived by my predecessor about 10 years ago, is to develop more fully the intellectual debate at SMU by stimulating discussions among students, faculty, and staff about matters of interest and importance and related to the disciplines that we have in our university. Now, you may wonder why I deviated from the tradition of inviting an outsider. I don't deviate from inviting somebody who is internationally eminent, but I normally invite an outsider and offer this time the platform for the Presidential Distinguished Lecture Series to what I would call a recent insider. This is indeed the first time that I decided to invite a member of our own faculty to speak in this PDLS, and you can question, as I said, why. Well, about 6 months ago, Professor Lily Kong offered me a copy of her latest book on religion and space. You saw a copy or a picture of that before, a little bit earlier on. So, Religion and Space, Competition, Conflict, and Violence in the Contemporary World, written with her co-author, Dr. Orlando Woods. Now, I have to say, I got the book, but the next morning I had to tell her that I almost had a sleepless night. I say this tongue-in-cheek. But as I often do when I get a new book, I take it home and glance through it during the evening. But I have to admit that often I put those books aside after a short while. For those among you who gave me a book, I don't do that with everybody, right? Right. Not this time, however. I kept on reading till deep in the night and became more and more interested in what Professor Kong and her co-author discussed in the book. And I thought that it would be a pity that only a small group of specialized readers would have the opportunity to hear about the creative research and the creative ideas developed by our Provost and her co-author on how religious groups interact and negotiate for space in the contemporary world. Actually, I reflected on the fact that as deans, and there are a few of them here, as Provost, and yes, myself as President, we actually have rarely the occasion to engage in a discussion about our research. Faculty always complain about other things when they see us. And I decided that I would create the opportunity for Provost Professor Lily Kong to showcase her research to the broader SMU community and to our friends. Now, let me give you a quick introduction to today's speaker, although I think that most of you in the room will know her. Professor Lily Kong is currently Provost and Lee Kong Chen Chair Professor of Social Sciences at SMU. She is widely regarded as one of the world's leading social and cultural geographers. She is a graduate of NUS and University College London and was a faculty member in the NUS Department of Geography, as well as the Dean of NUS Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. After 24 years as a researcher and a top administrator at NUS, which included also Vice President for University and Global Relations, Professor Kong joined SMU last September, slightly more than a year ago, as Singapore's first woman Provost. It is the first time also since the very first lecture in 2005 when Professor Abdullahi Ahmed An-Naim of Emory University spoke on Islam, human rights and secularism, that a lecture in the series has addressed religion. She is indeed highly regarded for her research on religion, cultural policy and creative economy, her urban heritage and conservation, and national identity. Professor Kong is on a dozen editorial boards of international journals in her field and is frequently invited as a keynote speaker to conferences in her domain. Her recent publications not only include Religion and Space, Competition, Conflict, and Violence in the Contemporary World, but also Foodways and Foodscapes, Culture, Community, and Consumption in Post-Colonial Singapore, and a book on arts, culture, and the making of global cities, creating new urban landscapes in Asia. I have enjoyed also glancing to both books, as they definitely gave me new insights and perspectives on living in Singapore and the region. Professor Kong has received 5 international fellowship awards, including the Commonwealth Fellowship Award and the Fulbright Fellowship Award. And she has also won an award from the Association of American Geographers for her contributions to the study of religion. Religion and space is the topic of the lecture today. As president of a university in Singapore's city center, I'm only too aware of the problems of managing competing claims for space. However, as sites of worship and destinations of pilgrimage, physical spaces sometimes take on a sacred significance. As different religious and secular needs compete for physical and symbolic space, conflict and even violence may erupt. As a result, spaces sometimes become places to be fought over, defended, and protected. This raises many questions, of which some Professor Kong will address today. How do religious groups make claims to both religious and secular spaces, and how are such claims managed, negotiated, and contested by different secular and religious agencies? How have these dynamics evolved as globalization gives rise to new forms of religious competition? And at the same time, in the face of competition, conflict, and violence, how do religious groups help to develop a capacity for social resilience amongst their adherents? How do religious groups react to situations that require social resilience, and how can social resilience be used as a form of religious regulation? These are many, many difficult questions, and I am sure you can't address them all, but I hope that in the coming 45 minutes we will learn a little bit about your insights based on your research. Thank you all for coming into this secular space, and I wish you an intellectually enlightening experience. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Lily Kong.
Very good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to see very many familiar faces in the crowd, and I think it's particularly nice to see that we have colleagues and friends from all 3 universities, NUS, NTU, and of course SMU. There are also many friends from government agencies that I see in the audience, as well as religious groups that I've interacted with before. Hi, Angeline, another student of mine. So first of all, I want to thank President Anna de Meyer for the honor of presenting in this lecture series. It is true that all the invitees have been very distinguished foreigners from different parts of the world, and as I was walking by the board a little bit earlier, I saw a picture of Hillary Clinton there, so very hard act to follow there. I want to acknowledge my co-author for this work, Orlando Woods. He's a former PhD student of mine. Unfortunately, he's unable to be with us today because he's returned to Britain and works there. But any difficult questions that you have after the talk, please direct to him. As I mentioned earlier, there are very many friends in the crowd. I also noticed that, you know, many differences. Those with academic backgrounds, it's probably going to be a question about my methodology from the academics in the crowd or something. And then others who are much more interested in policy questions or, you know, everyday praxis questions may have a different take on what I have to say. So this is my caveat for saying that it's a talk that's probably not going to satisfy anyone. So with that, let me just launch into what I would like to speak about. The book is particularly focused on the question on who are the competitors when we talk about religious competition, and what are the characteristics of such religious competition. What I do in the book together with Orlando is to go through the different types of religious competition, competition between religious groups, inter-religious competition, competition within religious groups, intra-religious competition. I also look at relationships between religion and a secular state, so religion-state competition, and religion and secular groups, right? Religion-secular competition. What are the characteristics of such religious competition? What is the competition over? What are the dissatisfactions about? Why do people get into conflict? Why does it sometimes evolve into violence, right? And what are the conditions that precipitate such competition, whether social, political, economic, or regulatory environments that might actually precipitate the competition? And what are the conditions that might help to de-escalate the competition? I also asked the question, what is the likelihood that competition can escalate into conflict and into violence, right? As the President has said, there's no way in which I'm going to cover everything that I would like to say. So this is necessarily going to be a little bit touch and go on various of these points in response to these questions that I've posed. But there will be some time for discussion at the end, and maybe we can leave some of the questions till that point. I am a geographer, which means that as a geographer, my interest is in space. Sometimes this gets geographers into trouble because space is, of course, the physical space that we're all familiar with, whether it's religious space or secular space or quasi-secular space. I'll talk about each of these in a moment. But it's also, in a certain sense, metaphorical space when we talk about political space or we talk about social space, right? Or we talk about the spaces of the arts or spaces of media and so forth, right? And so what the book does is to take on board all these different kinds of spaces and to talk about the competition that goes on through these spaces and because of these spaces. Now let me first say something about the physical spaces. The religious space, clearly, what we would ordinarily think of as religious spaces, whether they're the places of worship, your churches, temples, mosques, gurdwaras, and so forth, places of religious instruction, places that are set aside exclusively for religious ritual, and that could, for example, be a burial ground, right? Secular spaces, this is a secular space ordinarily, but sometimes spaces such as this get turned over for religious use. So, for example, you all know of auditoriums which ordinarily might have a performer on stage, and then on the weekend you might actually have a religious event taking place, a religious service taking place, right? So whether it's workspaces or state-run schools which are supposed to be secular, public amenities such as auditoriums, parks, markets, MRT trains, etc. These are secular spaces. But sometimes secular spaces, as I've just mentioned a moment ago, can take on religious implications. They can house religious activities. And that is when some interesting dynamic then takes place. There are also what I call, or what we call, quasi-secular spaces. And what do we mean by that? These are spaces that are ordinarily affiliated with religious groups, but perform primarily secular functions, right? So for example, a school, a mission school, a school that is run by a missionary group. I went to one across the street at the Convent of the Holy Infant Jesus. It's a secular school for all intents and purposes, but run by the nuns in the early days. Clearly traumatized me so much that I'm lost for words at this point in time. Or you could have hospitals that are owned by religious groups or faith-based organizations that are engaged in social service, right? Bless them, really. So these different kinds of spaces are what animate the book, and the cases that we look at, the examples that we cite and analyze revolve around these different types of spaces. The other axis by which the book is organized is in terms of the kinds of competition, and you've already heard me saying that we refer to interreligious competition, intra-religious competition, religion-state, religion-secular competition. So let me begin with intra-religious. I have grouped them together for for lack of time, but of course there are differences and nuances within. Here I just focus on certain commonalities in the kind of competition between religious groups and within religious groups. I'd characterize the competition in the following way, that very often it is about competition over access to and ownership of spaces, as well as the authority and autonomy to behave in certain ways, function in certain ways in those spaces, right? So in brief, ownership claims and authority autonomy claims as such. Let me elaborate. Competing ownership claims are very real and have sometimes, unfortunately, in different parts of the world, led to conflict and violence. And this is when two or more religious groups claim the same religious space as exclusively theirs. There are many examples that we can cite around the world. Those of you well, I'm sure examples are already in the forefront of your minds this moment. You can think about Temple Mount in Old City of Jerusalem as a case in point, right? Where you have the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims sort of recognizing that as sacred space. Another example where unfortunately it ended in violence and death was in the case of the Babri Mosque in India, right? And in Ayodhya in Uttar Pradesh in particular, where the conflict was between Hindus and Muslims, right? Because both groups believed the space to be sacred space belonging to their religion, right? Archaeological evidence was not conclusive as to which came first, etc., but each believed firmly and fervently that that was their sacred space, that space had taken on a particular meaning, symbolic, deep, meaningful, and not something that can be explained away rationally, easily and rationally, but deeply felt, right? And those sorts of competition, unfortunately, sometimes lead to violence. In the case of the particular Babri Mosque that I talk about in Uttar Pradesh, in 1992, the conflict was so stark that the mosque was demolished by a Hindu crowd and led to riots and deaths across the country, right? Now is not the time to go into the cause and the effect and the resolution of it and why it happened, etc. But the fact of the matter is that such deeply felt feelings about a place can lead to death. Very often, when you have circumstances like this, what it means is that there is a very long history of unresolved conflict and very difficult to address. Status quo is not quite satisfactory, and yet addressing it in some way also dislodges whatever uncomfortable balance there is at that point in time and can lead to that conflict, violence, death, and so forth, right? So very difficult situations to address. Aside from these competing ownership claims over the same religious space, it's also very often the case that there is competition between existing religions and denominations within religions. This often happens when there is land scarcity, right? And this is true in so very many cities in the world today, where the growth of migrant numbers has meant that cities have become more crowded, different practices are coming into contact with one another, people are living cheek by jowl and not necessarily understanding practices of the other. Now, the other need not be another religion, it could be the same religion, but religion is not an a priori category. What do I mean by that? It does mean that the same religion practiced from place to place can have slight differences, right? So how a Catholic performs certain rituals and practices in the Philippines may be different from how it's practiced in Britain, for example. Not completely different, but sufficient nuances and sufficient differences that even if you're of the same religious group, sometimes the differences can lead to a lack of understanding or a misunderstanding. So that sort of competition can also exist. Unfortunately, the third category of competition that exists is very prevalent in the world today with what I call the entrant incumbent competition, which is basically a new group, a new religion entering into a space where that religion did not exist prior to that moment, right? And that, you see plenty of examples in Europe, which is probably what got Arno reading a little bit more into the book, I think, because he said to me the morning after, besides saying to me that I caused him a sleepless night, he said that, you know, he could resonate with what was happening, reading about some of what was happening in Europe through the book. And what is happening in Europe, many examples of that in Germany, in Luxembourg, in France, and so forth, is the fact that a newish population in the form of Muslims are moving into predominantly white areas. And there are many, many, many case studies that have been done by geographers, sociologists, and other social scientists of how that has caused discomfort in predominantly white neighborhoods, basically saying, well, we don't want this new building in our backyard. We don't want the mosque to be built near to us. And all kinds of reasons are cited for that, other than the fact that it's a different religion. It's, oh, it's going to cause traffic congestion, or it's going to cause noise pollution, it's this, that, and the other. But the long and short of it is that the entrant finds a very difficult time in terms of finding space, literally, for themselves, and metaphorically for practicing their religion. When you have this kind of entrant-incumbent competition, sometimes it segues into a positive outcome, but sometimes it gets into a very protracted situation where that conflict just won't go away, right? And the question is, under what circumstances or what kinds of factors are likely to influence that outcome? And through the cases that we look at in the book, we identify certain sorts of conditions which influence the longer-term outcome, right? A lot of it has to do with the intensity and the fractiousness of the early disputes. When those early disputes take place, what happens, right? What intervention takes place that can then either positively shape later outcomes or actually exacerbate the negativity of those outcomes. And this, I won't be able to go into chapter and verse about each individual case that we looked at, but just to cite some more generic conclusions that we came to. We have found, for example, that when there is a new religion and that is adopted by leaders in society, in the case of our particular example of South Korea, it was Christianity in South Korea, and the acceptance, in fact, the embracing of that religion by the political elites made it much easier for the religion to find its feet in society, right? But it doesn't have to be political leaders. It could be other leaders in society, and indeed it could be your pop stars, right? In some situations, basically the people who have some kind of influence over society, and if they are seen to embrace the religion, or at least accept, or one level removed, tolerate the religion, then the likely outcome is more positive than negative, right? Sometimes it's less touchy-feely than that. It's not down to individuals or groups of leaders. It's actually worked into legislature, constitution, and so forth, right? So, for example, when there is a guarantee of protection for entrant religions, constitutional protection of minority religions and minority groups, right? That can be a powerful signal to society at large about the tone that is being set and what is acceptable norm in society. Another interesting way in which this kind of entrant incumbent relationship or interaction plays out is dependent on how the entrant religion is willing to accept a culture-specific version of the religion. What do I mean by that? I give you the example of Taiwan, which is an example that we cited in the book. And in predominantly Chinese Taiwan, where a lot of where there's religion and a lot of that commitment to religion is to broadly define Chinese religion, and I use the term Chinese religion rather than Buddhism or Confucianism or Taoism because very often it's syncretic, right? So that was what existed, and an entrant religion like Christianity years ago, decades ago really, the entrant religion found it easier to find acceptance because they were willing to embrace a culture-specific version of the religion. What do I mean by that? We're all familiar, or I assume we're all familiar with ancestor worship. We're all familiar with how, you may not be a Taoist or a Buddhist or an ancestor worshipper, I suppose. But if you're willing to hold the joss stick, or to maybe not even hold the joss stick, but to give your respect to your ancestors at the front of the ancestral tablet, for example, then that acceptability to the incumbent religion tends to be higher, right? And that is exactly what happened in Taiwan, that the church in its first entry into Taiwan was willing to say this is acceptable behavior for those who might have converted to Christianity, but who still want to pay respect to their ancestors through the traditional ways, right? Now, I'm fully conscious that that's not always the case, but in that particular case, in that particular context, that acceptability was there, and it worked to moderate a sense of threat, if you will, of a different and new religion entering into the space. The factors affecting likely outcomes, we should also think about systemic conditions, which actually can sometimes enhance conflicts. And this is the case study of India and Sri Lanka, particularly, and Orlando's work was particularly focused on Sri Lanka. So if I get it wrong, it's his fault. But basically, the laws were written into the books that you cannot convert by coercion, and any kind of conversion that is deemed to be achieved through either coercion or undue influence, that conversion is not recognized by the law. So there's actually a law written into the books that's called the anti-conversion law, and it allows, therefore, actually all conversions to be contested, right? Because you can quite easily say, my child was forcibly converted, and let's contest that, okay? So under those sorts of circumstances, with those sorts of laws written perhaps for good reason, the outcomes may be sometimes unintended. Just very quickly, a last point about the kinds of conditions that affect the likely outcomes. Sometimes new religions entering into a space are very little understood, are not well understood, right? New religions, some of you may have read about new religions, sometimes new Japanese religions, for example. They're not well understood, they're not well known, and people think then of them as cults, right? And that raises the barriers, and the conflict comes into play as a consequence. I would also like to say that one of the conditions under which competition is exacerbated today in the contemporary world is globalization and the related migration that goes on. With globalization, you have new sources of migrants with potentially new sources of religion. You have rising numbers of migrants. So where in the past you might have a very small group of people belonging to a new religion, now you might see a far larger group, a far larger presence, much more in your face, so to speak, and therefore it causes anxiety, right? But also with globalization, the character of local religious competition becomes global. What do I mean by that? Something that's happening, some conflict that's happening somewhere else, instantaneously gets brought into not even our living rooms. It used to be our living rooms because we were watching television. Now it's the mobile phone, right? Now it's the tablet. You can see images sometimes of stark violence that's happening somewhere else, which could be religiously rooted, and you see that right away in your face. And that can be very powerful, very emotional, and can generate a reaction way before authorities can think about how to manage the fallout, right? So that sort of thing that comes about with globalization, technology, mediation, and migration is very real and can exacerbate the conditions under which competition takes place. I would also add class and resource-related concerns. What do I mean by that? When you have certain groups in society that feel like we are the haves and others that are the have-nots, and if that is coincident with religious lines, right? So you feel like certain religious groups get access to the funds, others don't get access to the resources, etc. It exacerbates the competition, right? I've already spoken about the technology. Well, I've spoken a little bit about the technology. I want to elaborate further about the technology. Technology, or to use Arjun Appadurai's term of technoscapes, right? Basically, the intersection of technology and religion takes two forms. What in the literature is called religion online and online religion. Religion online means going to cyberspace to find information about religion, right? But online religion basically means practicing religion in cyberspace. So I don't know how many of you have come across some of these, but there are memorial practices for the deceased that you can perform online. It's quite a big thing in China, for example, because you know, every year during Qingming, which is, you know, the tomb sweeping festival, whereas people used to travel city to return to their hometown in order to sweep the tombs, pay their respects, etc. Now, one of the things they can do is they can do it online. They can do offerings online. Okay, so too with death rituals and so forth. So sorry for the sidetrack, but that's online religion where you're actually practicing your rituals online as such. But what it means when you have both religion online and online religion is that people have much easier access to online religious material. And what that can mean is that the authority of religious leaders to determine content and scope is influenced by the internet, right? So the authority of the religious leaders sometimes may be undermined by what is available on the internet. And the question of the authenticity of internet-mediated material is sometimes subject to question. For those of us in the audience who are lecturers and professors, and those of you who are students, well, actually for everybody, you will realize that what is on the web is not entirely always reliable. And that includes religious material and interpretations of religious material. There is also the question of the authenticity of the internet-mediated religious rituals and the experience of participating in religion. But what it means is that those religious groups that are able to harness technology may be better able to reach out to followers, may be able to keep the adherence better. And so a different kind of competition has been enabled through technology. A lot of what I've spoken about has to do with inter-religion and intra-religious competition as such. I'd like to turn attention to religion-state relations as such. And the competition for physical space is very real when we think about religions and states. By state, I mean it could be a city government, it could be a municipal authority, it could be a national authority, etc., right? But competition for physical space, for religious use and secular use is ongoing all the time. And indeed, competition for space for different kinds of secular uses are going on all the time. This competition can sometimes mean that there is the demolition of religious buildings, there is the relocation of religious buildings, right? When you say, we need the space for a highway, or we need the space for new housing, and therefore the religious building has to find some other location, right? But the competition for space also plays itself out in the NIMBY syndrome, the not in my backyard syndrome, right? Which means to say, fine, we are a multi-religious, multicultural, multiracial neighborhood, but if you want to have your new, whatever, church, temple, mosque, synagogue, etc., in the neighborhood, then we're going to vehemently disagree and we're going to vehemently say no. It's fine to have it, just not in my neighborhood. And all kinds of reasons get trotted out, right? That sort of competition for space takes place between religious groups and a secular authority that has responsibility for urban planning, that has secular responsibility for looking after the interests of different sectors and different groups in society. Right? One of the first things that I learned as a PhD student was that there was no such thing as the public interest, because there are multiple publics and multiple interests as a result. And the role of authorities is to try and balance up the different interests as much as possible. Another consideration in terms of how religion and state have to interact and come to some kind of satisfactory conclusion about the allocation of space for religious use must take into consideration the changing nature of religion, the changing nature of religious groups. So in Singapore, for example, there are planning norms. In a particular housing estate, if you have X number of households or individuals that are of this religion, then a site is set aside for bidding for religious purposes for that particular religious group. Those norms have been in place for a very long time. In the meantime, the changing nature of religion means that mega churches have appeared, independent small churches have appeared, house churches have appeared on the scene. How do we cater to these different kinds of needs? Right? At the same time, different practices in still other religions, in Buddhism, for example, one of the things that has happened in the context of Singapore in the last maybe almost 2 decades now is that there is a more meditative, more scriptural form of Buddhism that is perhaps less syncretic than earlier forms, and some have actually described it as Protestant Buddhism. Why is that term used? Because some of the practices of Protestant Christianity have been taken over into this particular form of formation of Buddhism, which basically has, you know, study groups, cell groups, sort of cell groups as in Christianity, coming together for fellowship, for studying not the Bible in this case, but the scriptures in the case of Buddhism, etc. So some of the practices mirror a certain kind of Protestant Christianity, and I think it was Jean Bernardi who, who said Protestant Buddhism, right? She gave it the term Protestant Buddhism. Conscious of the time, so I'm not going to go into every single example or case that I have. Now, the competition over space is one form of competition, and those sorts of conditions that I mentioned earlier have to do with, is this my space? Can I have this space? Can I not have this space? Do I have to move to make way for something else, and so forth? But the competition can very often also be over authority to decide the kinds of activities that go on in religious space. So remember I mentioned ownership, conflicts over ownership and conflicts over authority and autonomy. Here I'm talking about the second, which is competition over authority to decide the type of activities in religious spaces. And I have several examples, but I probably won't go through all of them, just to cite a couple to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. So the regulation of religious practices in religious spaces, for example, the use of loudspeakers in mosques to broadcast the call for prayer, right? And in some places, in different parts of the world, that use of the loudspeaker has been banned. In other spaces, other kinds of encouragement to have that same practice, but not through the use of loudspeakers that affect the entire sort of neighborhood and community, encouraging people to use the radio instead, turning on the radio for the azan, the call to prayer, and so forth, right? So how does each society find a way of enabling the religious practice to take place while taking into consideration the considerations and the needs of other groups in society, right? And who has authority to decide what is permissible and what is not? Regulation of places of religious instruction is another example. In the book, we cite examples from the Pondok in the case of Thailand, and even in the schools in China, what kinds of curriculum are acceptable in schools, how much does religion get into the curriculum, and so forth. Now, one of our concerns was not, in the book, was not just to highlight all the difficulties and the challenges and the competition and the conflict and the violence, etc., but to also look at ways in which there have been successful management strategies. And this is my claim to being in a Singapore Management University. And the strategies to minimize conflict between religion and state get played out in different ways in different societies. One is to foster consensus, in as much as it's possible, with religious groups about the value of certain secular goals in society for the city and for the country, right? So that if our goals are common and we know why we need to do certain things, so housing for the poor, for example, right? If we're committed to that, and if it means the relocation of a religious building because that particular site matters particularly, is well suited for low-cost housing or whatever it is, then the commitment to the same endpoint, the same goal, helps in terms of mediating and coming to some kind of consensus. Fostering a sense of national identity above sectoral identities. I've also looked at many speeches of government leaders in Singapore, but elsewhere, where religious teachings are, in a sense, used to help explain why certain secular material goals are good for society, right? I literally won't cite chapter and verse now, but it is supporting actions of the state with religious justifications, right? Other ways that other kinds of municipal authorities have used is to say that certain land-intensive religious practices are actually not essential to the maintenance of specific religious identities. So, you know, you don't actually need to practice your religion in this particular way that is so land-intensive, because actually if you return to the roots of your religion, your scriptures, and so forth, there's nothing in there that says you have to practice in that particular way, right? That's another strategy that some city authorities have used. Very critically, and used to quite good effect in Singapore, to create and sustain the perception and the agreement, not just a perception, but the agreement that actually the state has been even-handed in managing different religions. So I might be demolishing this particular religious building and relocating it somewhere else. We're not targeting a religious group because numerous religions are affected as well, right? So that sense of even-handedness as opposed to feeling like you're targeted. And then, of course, developing clear rules that govern religious behavior in secular spaces. And actually, I will talk about this in a moment, so I'm not going to detail the example right now. So I've talked about intra-religious competition. I've talked about religion-state competition, which actually segues nicely into religion-secular competition, right? Because very often the state may be a secular state, but here I want to focus on secular groups in society, secular individuals in society, and how they deal with religion, right? Now, I share this about Singapore, but of course the book is not just about Singapore. If you look on the left, in the bar chart, you will see this is census data that the resident population aged 15 and above with no religious affiliation has been growing over time. And those of you who read the article in Straits Times yesterday, this will also be familiar, right? But at the same time, it's wrong, I think, to go away thinking that with modernization and globalization, that is an inevitable trend, and we're going to find ourselves becoming the secular world that Peter Berger, the sociologist, predicted once, right? He predicted the secularization of the world, and he's eaten his own words since. Sorry, that wasn't meant to be funny, but okay. So one of the things that has been observed is that there is an abiding influence of religion amidst modernization and globalization, because people in facing a rapidly changing society and a rapidly changing world are prompted to search for meaning in life, and some people search for meaning in life through religion. You will also find that there's, as I've mentioned before, large-scale migration, which means that religion is moving, right? People are moving and they're carrying with them their religion, and they're carrying their religion to places that are not necessarily that religious to start off with. One of the things that has been written about is how actually there is a reverse evangelization taking place, that actually it's the missionaries from Asia and Africa who are bringing religion back into Europe, right? So what is the effect of that? Is that increasing religious participation in Europe in any sense? Technology-aided dissemination of religious messages, and because we all now have, well, in many societies, and Singapore is a case in point where there's more than 100% penetration, we all have our mobile devices where access to material, including material about religion, is easy, and the cost of participation is reduced in that sense, right? So for all these different types of reasons, there have been scholars who've argued for a post-secular world, right? That the world is not the secular place that had been imagined, it's not the completely secular place that had been imagined, that in fact, post-secularism has crept in, and I won't go into the conceptual issues about post-secularism, but the long and short of it is that the two are happening at the same time, right? Now, what this means is that you will continue to have religion in many societies, and that religion is going to make incursions into secular spaces, and that incursion takes place in many ways, right? You see the examples here. Quite common in many societies is wearing religious garb at school and work, right? It is conducting prayer and ritual-related practices at school, at work. I'm struck by how, as I drive into SMU during the Hungry Ghost month, how much is going on in the back alleys, right? Home worship, people, sort of practicing Chinese religion, Christianity, etc., within the home, auditoriums, hotels, industrial space. In fact, the industrial space has been codified and sanctioned in the context of Singapore, right? Religious processions that necessarily go out into secular space. And then, of course, you also have those in certain religions who will say that we cannot perform certain functions at work or in the army, for example, because the secular workplace requirements conflict with our religious tenets, right? And then, of course, in hospitals, in prisons, and so forth, religion is there, where inmates in prisons or sick people in hospitals feel like some religion might be helpful for them in coping with that adversity at that particular point in time. And so you get that religion-secular intersection in many different ways in society, right? And many societies have this kind of interaction. When does that interaction become problematic, and how do we deal with that? The interaction becomes problematic when you have religious groups and secular segments of society saying to other religions, what you're doing is unacceptable, what you're doing is causing me inconvenience, what you're doing is causing me grief, and so forth, right? And this happens at different levels. Most of the time, you might get grumbles in city living of noise pollution, of traffic congestion, of proselytization in our, with things shoved into our mailbox, etc. But in the context of Singapore, at least, a lot of this has been managed and well regulated. So I go back to what I said about religion-state interaction, where the state, as the secular body, in the context of Singapore and in many other contexts, is the one that helps to moderate between different needs and desires of different societies. And the work in the book elaborates on the spatial and temporal strategies of containment, of management in different contexts to different levels of success. How the state responds to religion's incursion or presence in public secular spaces can take one of two forms. It can be deterrent, which means restricting the expression of religious identity in public. And that can be done through using legal structures, for example. So a law can be enacted, as has happened, right? So in certain boroughs in Montreal, for example, religious processions are just prohibited, period, all right? Or it can be more accommodationist, which means that, yes, religious practice can take place, but limit religious behavior when it really sort of infringes on public order issues, right? Of course, the devil is in the detail, and the quality of decision-making is what can lead to peaceful resolution or exacerbation of conflict. Just one other note about how states respond to religion's encroachment on public secular spaces. And we've noted this in numerous cases in different parts of the world, where the response to religion's presence in the public secular spaces can be one of two, which is just, one is to say we are a secular space. And by secularism, it means an absence of space to maintain religious differences. So we're a secular space, no religion, right? So the absence of space to maintain religious difference. But another response is to adopt a more multicultural approach, which is to say, yes, religion has a place in society, including secular society, but the expression of it needs to be multicultural, not monocultural. So it's not a particular religion that's valorized and privileged. It is, let's try to ensure that the expression of religious differences is equally possible to all different groups. Okay, okay, I'm not going to go into this part because I think I've taken quite a bit of time. I'm just going to The next bit actually has to do with religious secular competition in particular settings, right? In political spaces where it plays out through electoral activities, or in social spaces where it plays out in partnership activities between religion and secular groups as such, right? I don't have time to go into this, but I'm happy to talk about it if there are any interested individuals later. I do want to turn to talk about religion and social resilience, because while I have spent about 50 minutes talking about competition, conflict, and violence, I want to end off more positively on the kinds of positives that come with religious competition, or that can come with religious competition. So as I've said, religious competition conjures conflict and violence. But religious competition also offers the opportunity for positives. It offers choice to individuals, right? That you consider what works for you and what you think you subscribe to and you believe in. Religious competition means that different groups are working to provide support to individuals, psychological support, social support, and religious groups are offering social services to enhance societal well-being, whether it's healthcare, care for the elderly, care for the sick, and so forth, right? What this means is that religion has the possibility to increase the resilience quotient of a society and of an individual. At the individual level, it is possible that religions can help individuals recover from personal setbacks. This is the work of psychologists, which look at, communities like the young, the elderly, women, the disabled, and so forth, and how religion can be a source of support and help in improving the lot of individuals when they confront personal setbacks. But resilience can also be considered at a societal level. So societal resilience, in examining how religion helps societies and communities recover from adversities. Such adversities could be major environmental disasters, and the work of scholars in environmental studies, in hazard studies as it's called, goes into this, right? When you have Aceh tsunamis, for example, the religious groups are there to try to help, and I might add, to try to convert sometimes. And the way in which religion can work to enhance whether it's individual or societal resilience is through helping to develop the proactive capacity of religious groups and the reactive capabilities of the same groups. What do I mean by that? The proactive capacity means that you anticipate adversities, right? You expect that adversities are going to happen. You try and figure out how to create options to either prevent those adversities or to minimize those adversities as such. And then there are reactive capabilities, which is after adversity strikes, how does religion help those who are affected to recover from and adjust to those vulnerable conditions? And in terms of building proactive capacities, understanding the nature and form of religious-linked adversities is a big step towards that. The ability to harness religion for social welfare, I've already mentioned religious groups getting into the social provision space as a way of building the proactive capacity. And in developing the reactive capabilities, aside from the very direct contribution of religion to helping individuals cope, sort of psychologically, emotionally, and so forth, there is the other dimension of developing reactive capabilities, which is to try to understand how, in times of adversity, religious leaders and religious groups can be a very important way of reaching out and stabilizing society as such. So to do that requires that religious leaders have a certain authority, influence over the adherents, and has that effect on religious adherents. And what it means is that we need to understand religious networks, religious leadership, religious influence, and how that works out in order to be able to leverage on those networks and influences in times of adversity. I will stop there and end off by saying that the book itself is wide-ranging in the cases that we draw on. Some of them are work that we have done over the years. Some of them draw from the literatures and the work of other scholars. But insistently, what we try and do is to look at how religion and religious competition can have the debilitating effects of conflict and violence. But towards the end of the book, as I've done in the talk, we also try to demonstrate the possibilities of religion in building individual and social resilience. With that, I thank you for your attention.